Welcome to Autism Approved, brought to you by Enzymedica. Now here's your host, Kristin Selby Gonzalez.
Hi, and welcome to Autism Approved. I'm your host, Kristin Selby Gonzalez. Well, right now we are currently in Seattle, Washington, where the U.S. Autism and Asperger Association is launching their 6th annual World Conference. If you want more information about this conference or to see any of the presentations, please visit them at their website at www.usautism.org. First, I'd like to introduce one of their presenters. Gosh, he is just an amazing speaker, and he's all over the world. His name is Stephen Shore, and he is the Assistant Professor of Special Education at Adelphi University in New York. And he's also a best-selling author of several books, Beyond the Wall, Understanding Autism for Dummies, Ask and Tell, and he even has a DVD that's called Living Along the Autism Spectrum. So welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
You know, I've seen you at so many conferences, and you're so inspirational. Every time I hear you speak, every time I hear the motivational things you tell parents, and even people living on the spectrum, I mean, you are just out there doing it.
Oh yeah, I do make the rounds.
I don't think I've been to a conference yet where I've not seen you. So you're just all travel over the country. How many conferences do you go to a year?
Well, that's hard to say. Maybe about 70. I've never really counted.
Wow. So you're you're a professor in New York, but you're also just traveling constantly.
Right. So I divide my time between teaching at Adelphi University in New York, courses in autism for people who are studying to become teachers, social workers, and child psychologists. So I'm there, I teach. I also do research on comparing different approaches for working with children on the autism spectrum. So the idea is to take some of the more well-known approaches and see if we can move the conversation towards matching the approach to the needs of the child.
Because unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all, right?
Right. There's many approaches, and they all focus on different things. And the autism spectrum is so incredibly wide and diverse that it just makes sense that different people are going to be helped using different techniques and approaches.
And I love that. I love the fact that there's just so many options that people can look at to see, well, maybe this might help my child, or somebody who's an adult even, that maybe those treatments weren't available years ago, that maybe there's therapies or different techniques or
exactly
things to help regulate or self-cope, or however you want to look at that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, at what age were you diagnosed with autism?
Well, I was diagnosed, I guess I should say I was hit with what I call the autism bomb at 18 months.
18 months.
So like half of us on the spectrum, I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, tantrums, and all kinds of autistic behaviors. And it took my parents a full year to find a place to get me diagnosed. So finally, at 2.5, the professionals who diagnosed me said they had never seen a child who was so sick, and they recommended institutionalization. Fortunately, my parents advocated on my behalf. I did end up in an institution, but it was an institution of higher education, namely Adelphi University. But that joke aside, they said no, and they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that they applied what we would today term as an intensive home-based early intervention program. But in those days, that terminology just didn't exist.
And what do they do in their home-based interventions?
Well, in today's terms, we would call it an intensive home-based early intervention program, emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. Practically what it was really just parents doing what they felt their child needed.
They're following their gut instincts.
They were following their gut instincts, and it was mostly my mother, my dad was there too, but in those days it was his job to hunt a saber-toothed tiger or a mastodon. And the mother would stay home and do mommy things.
Yeah.
So at first she tried to get me to imitate her, and that didn't work. So then she flipped it around, and she began to imitate me. And once I did that, I became aware of her in my environment. And then she was able to move me along.
Do you remember becoming aware of her for the first time?
No, I don't remember that specific time. I remember spending a lot of time at home listening to music, moving to music, and doing things like that. Rumor has it that I had speech therapy. At least that's what my parents tell me. I just have to believe them on that one.
Now, I'm fascinated. So how long did your mom work with you then?
That would be, I'd say, about a year and a half.
And then you started to emerge?
Then, yeah, by the time age 4 rolled around, speech was beginning to come back. And I entered the school that initially rejected me because they said I was too sick, as they termed it. And I got reevaluated. So I got upgraded, you might say, from psychotic, atypical development, and strong autistic tendencies to just being neurotic. So things were moving up in the world.
Oh, that's good. I mean, you went from one level of, one label to the next, I guess.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So at what age did your parents feel that you were independent and where you felt like you were coming into your own?
Well, that just kind of, it's a long process.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no specific time. All I can say is that, again, by age 4, speech was beginning to come back.
When you say beginning, was it just a few words that were happening at that moment?
Just a few words, and it was difficult for people to understand what I was saying. However, by age 5.5 or so, my speech was pretty much at typical levels.
Oh, good.
And I entered regular school kindergarten at age 6.
Wow. So you were not behind by any means at that moment.
Well, in some ways I was, and other ways I wasn't. In kindergarten, I was a social and academic catastrophe. You know what happens to children who are different in schools. Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And teachers didn't really know how to reach me. So I was probably considered as the FLK in the room.
Oh.
Funny looking kid. Right. So they didn't know what to do. I remember in 3rd grade, by then I had a number of focused interests or passions. The DSM refers to them as restricted interests. I prefer to refer to them as deep interests or passions. And one of them was astronomy. And I remember in the 3rd grade having a stack of astronomy books on my desk about this high. And I was busy copying diagrams and notes out of it. And the teacher told me that I'd never learn how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math to teach statistics at the university level.
Wow, that's just enough, huh?
Just enough, just a little bit.
Now, did your parents notice developmental issues from birth? Or, did you start developing normally before what you call the 18-month?
Yeah, that's why I call it the autism bomb.
Yeah.
Is that, like, for about half of us on the spectrum, between 18 and 24 months, something happens and causes a regression. So that's referred to as regressive autism. So there wasn't anything that was noticeable by my parents before that time.
Yeah, do they have an idea? Was there something that they believe led up to that in your case?
There is no idea as to why.
Just,
we can't point to any vaccinations or any other events.
Or any ear infections? Or...
Right, yeah. So we just don't know.
Infections and such growing up?
I don't remember any ear infections.
No, so it just basically, you woke up one day and they noticed it at 18 months around there somewhere.
Right, it probably just didn't happen over one day, but it probably happened over a period of weeks or months. And my parents were just totally befuddled as to what to do.
Were you already speaking? I know my son, my son has autism.
Right.
And he was developing totally typical up until about 15 months.
Mm-hmm.
And his first words were at 9 months.
Right.
And, if you were to see him at the moments where he was developing and hitting all those milestones,
right,
you wouldn't notice anything. And all of a sudden, it seemed like around 15 months we started noticing things. And it was a pretty slippery slope, right?
Yeah, right.
It was happening, but it happened probably within about a month of where we saw it really happen to where he hit where there was no language left. And so
right.
I was wondering if there was anything like that. Your parents obviously saw it. You were speaking at one point.
Yeah, as much as any 18-month-year-old would speak.
Mom, dad,
yeah, that type of...
That's how my son was.
Right.
Yeah. And so then they just lost it. And I imagine back then it was probably even more scary because they didn't have the awareness that we have today.
Yeah.